Okay, think about the ending of Hereditary. Annie is floating through the house. Peter is watching his own body do things he cannot stop. And up in that treehouse, that horrifying candlelit treehouse, the cult bows to a new king. It is perfect horror. Ari Aster built something so airtight, so suffocating, that by the time those credits roll, you feel like you personally need therapy. Maybe 2 therapists. Maybe just move to a different dimension entirely. But here's the thing about perfect horror films. They only feel inevitable after you've seen them. Before that, every single scene is a door. And most of those doors had another hallway behind them that nobody walked down. Welcome back, guys. I'm your guide through the multiverse of bad decisions, worse families, and ancient demon gods with surprisingly specific real estate preferences. Today, we are cracking open one of the most analyzed horror films of the 21st century, and we are asking a question that I genuinely cannot believe nobody has fully explored yet. What if Steve Graham knew? Not suspected, not vaguely felt uneasy about, knew. What if Steve, quiet, steady, perpetually confused Steve, the one character in Hereditary who feels like he wandered in from a normal movie, what if Steve discovered the full truth about Ellen Lee's cult, about payment, about everything his wife's family had been engineering for decades? And what if, instead of fighting it, he decided it was actually a pretty good deal? Because here's what the film never quite lets itself say out loud. Steve Graham is a man at the absolute end of his rope. And desperate men, guys, desperate men make catastrophic choices. Our point of divergence is one single scene. It happens approximately 43 minutes into the film. Annie has been attending her grief support group. She comes home. Steve is alone in the kitchen, and he finds, briefly, before the scene cuts away, a letter. We assume it's mundane. We assume Steve's whole deal is mundane. But what if that letter wasn't from the insurance company? What if it was from Joan? Right, let's build this properly, because a theory without architecture is just fan fiction, and we are better than that. First, let's establish who Steve Graham actually is in the canonical film, because the movie asks you to see him as a passive figure, and I think that reading undersells something really important. Steve is not stupid. He's not oblivious. He is, in clinical terms, a man who has adopted radical emotional suppression as a survival strategy. Think about it. He has been living with Annie's mental health crises for years. He has watched his son Peter become a hollow, guilt-ridden ghost of a teenager. He lost his daughter in the most traumatic way imaginable. And before all of that, he married into a family where his mother-in-law was, and I cannot stress this enough, actively hosting a demon cult in her social circle. Steve is a man who has trained himself not to look too hard at things, because every time he looks, what he finds is worse. Now, canon fact, established clearly in the film, Joan is not a random grief group acquaintance. Joan is a senior member of the Paimon cult. She is a recruiter. She is specifically assigned to manipulate Annie. And the cult's operation is not spontaneous. It is a decades-long, multi-generational project to place Paimon in a male Graham host. They needed Charlie. When Charlie died, they pivoted to Peter. But here's the logistical problem the film glosses over. The cult still needs the family unit intact long enough to complete the ritual. They need Annie to channel her grief into the seance. They need Peter to be psychologically broken and compliant. They need someone in that house to not call the police. In the original film, Steve plays that role accidentally. He suppresses, he denies, he rationalizes, right up until Annie burns his corpse. But what if Joan decided that accident was too risky? What if Joan sent Steve a letter? A carefully worded, terrifyingly specific letter that laid out exactly what Ellen had promised the cult, what the ritual required, and what Steve's family stood to gain if he cooperated. Here's why Steve doesn't immediately call the FBI and leave. Reason 1, the grief. Steve is drowning. Charlie is gone. His marriage is fracturing at the molecular level. He is watching his son deteriorate, and he has absolutely no framework for stopping it. The letter doesn't just threaten, it offers. Because the cult, per Joan's manipulation tactics we see in canon, is sophisticated enough to lead with the carrot before the stick. And the carrot Joan offers Steve is this. Peter doesn't have to suffer anymore. Paimon doesn't destroy its host. Paimon elevates it. In the cult's theology, twisted and monstrous as it is, Peter isn't being sacrificed. He's being chosen. And Steve, who has watched his son crumbling for months, who feels responsible, who feels helpless, Steve hears that differently than you or I would. Reason 2, the blackmail. Here's where it gets dark, guys. Joan's letter also contains documentation. Ellen's documentation. Financial records, photographs, records of Annie's hospitalizations. Evidence that could be weaponized against the entire family in ways that would destroy any hope of Peter having a normal life afterward. The cult has had decades to accumulate leverage. Steve is not just being offered a deal. He's being told, very politely, that declining the deal has consequences. Reason 3, and this is the big one, the rationalization. Steve is not a villain in his core characterization. He is a good man in an impossible position. And that is exactly the profile of someone who can be slowly, logically, walked into doing a monstrous thing. Because Joan doesn't ask Steve to grab a knife. She asks him to simply not interfere, to keep Annie emotionally destabilized, which he's been accidentally doing anyway, to make sure Peter doesn't leave the house during key nights, to destroy Annie's sketchbook if she gets too close to the truth. Small things, reasonable things, things Steve can tell himself are protective. He's keeping his family safe. He's managing a situation. He's being practical. This is how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. Not with a dramatic heel turn, with a series of small, justifiable steps that each feel, individually, survivable. So, Steve reads the letter. He sits with it for 3 days. He doesn't tell Annie. And then he calls Joan. Now, watch how the domino effect restructures the entire second act. In canon, Annie discovers the cult's books and becomes increasingly unhinged. Steve tries and fails to be a stabilizing influence. Annie burns the sketchbook. Steve burns himself. Because Annie, in her possession state, forces the notebook into the fire, and Steve, by the logic of the ritual, is incinerated. In our timeline, Steve doesn't try to be a stabilizing influence. Steve is the destabilizing force, deliberately. When Annie gets close to finding Ellen's books, Steve misdirects her. When Annie wants to talk to Peter, Steve creates friction. Not dramatically, not suspiciously, just enough. The quiet, persistent interference of a man who has decided that the path of least resistance runs straight through his family's destruction. And Annie, poor, brilliant, tortured Annie, she starts to suspect Peter. Because the one person in that house she never suspects is Steve. Steve is her anchor. Steve is the normal one. And the cult knew that. That's why they recruited him. Not because Steve is powerful, but because Steve is trusted. Annie's mental state deteriorates faster now because she has no one to reality check with. The one person who is quietly holding her tether to sanity has quietly let go of the rope. Peter is now alone in a house with a mother who suspects him, a father who has made a deal with the entities responsible for his sister's death, and a presence that is growing stronger by the night. The second act doesn't just change, it accelerates. Alright guys, buckle in, because this is where our alternate Hereditary becomes something genuinely terrifying. Not just as horror, but as a story about the specific, quiet way love can become a weapon. In canon, the climax of Hereditary is chaos. Annie is fully possessed. Peter is reactive, running, barely surviving. The cult operates in the shadows right up until the final reveal. In our timeline, the climax is something far worse. It is organized. Steve has spent the preceding weeks doing exactly what Joan instructed. He has kept Annie emotionally isolated. He has ensured that Peter, grieving, guilty, already cracking, has had no genuine support. He has removed every obstacle between the cult and its completion of the ritual. But here's where Steve's arc takes the turn that makes this theory genuinely devastating. Steve didn't do it for the cult. He did it for Peter. Or at least, that is what he told himself. And by the time the ritual night arrives, Steve has convinced himself so thoroughly of his own altruism that he cannot see what he has actually become. He has become Ellen. Ellen Lee, Annie's mother, the cult's original architect within the family, did exactly what Steve is doing. She rationalized. She told herself the sacrifice of her children's autonomy and safety was an act of devotion. She believed, on some level, that Payman's power would ultimately protect what she loved, even as it consumed it. Steve is Ellen's true successor, not Annie, Not Peter. Steve. Now, the night of the ritual. In our timeline, Steve is not in the house when the final sequence begins. Joan has advised him to leave, to give himself an alibi. He is sitting in his car, 3 streets away, telling himself that what is happening to his family is a transition, a promotion, a gift. And then his phone rings. It's Peter, not the cult's Peter, not Pyman's Peter, his son, the real one. The one who used to fall asleep in the car on long drives and had to be carried inside. The one who looked up to him. The one who is now screaming down a phone line, alone in a house that has become something else entirely. Because the man who was supposed to protect him decided the paperwork on protection was too complicated. And Steve gets out of the car. This is our ultimate climax's central axis, because Steve, who has been passive, rationalizing, compliant for weeks, makes a choice. He goes back. Not because he's suddenly heroic, not because he's had a clean moral epiphany, but because the sound of his son's voice is the one variable that Joan's letter could not account for. He drives back to the house, he runs inside, and he finds Peter, already in the treehouse. The cult is already assembled. Annie is already lost. The ritual is in its final minutes. Steve does the one thing he has not done throughout this entire nightmare. He picks up the sketchbook. Now, guys, pay attention here, because this is where our alternate timeline becomes not just a different horror film, but an argument about the nature of the original. In Ari Aster's canon, the sketchbook is destroyed. Its destruction is the point of no return. Annie burns it, and the ritual is sealed. But the canonical film also establishes that the sketchbook is the primary documentation of Ellen's pact. It is, effectively, the contract. Steve, who has spent weeks as the cult's quiet administrator, knows exactly what the book is. He knows what it represents. And he knows, because Joan told him, because the letter explained the mechanics, that if the book is destroyed before the ritual's completion, the incomplete possession is catastrophically unstable. Payman does not get a host. Payman gets fragments. What happens next is not heroic. This is not a clean victory. The alternate climax of our Hereditary is not a man saving his family. It is a man causing a contained catastrophe to prevent a larger one. The ritual doesn't complete. It unravels. The cult members, already in their altered states, experience the incomplete possession in ways the film leaves wisely ambiguous. Joan's fate is sealed by the very mechanics she weaponized. Annie, and this is the detail that matters most, Annie is free for a moment. The possession is interrupted. There is 1 second where she is Annie Graham again, standing in her own home, looking at her husband. She understands everything. Not just the cult, not just the ritual. She sees Steve. She sees what he chose. She sees why. And in that 1 second, before the consequences of the unraveling ritual close in around both of them, she doesn't scream. She doesn't rage. She says, "You thought you were protecting him." Not a question, a statement. Because Annie, who has been dismissed as unstable throughout the entire film, who has been the least believed character in every room she enters, turns out to have understood human nature better than anyone. Steve nods. And then the house decides the rest. Peter survives. The ritual is broken. But Peter Graham, who has witnessed every layer of this, emerges from that treehouse carrying knowledge no teenager should have. That his grandmother was a cultist. That his father made a deal. That his mother, in her final moment of clarity, found something like forgiveness for the unforgivable. The final shot of our alternate Hereditary is not a boy bowing to an ancient king. It is a boy standing alone in a driveway at dawn, perfectly still, deciding who he is going to be with everything he now knows. The camera holds on him for a long time, and then it cuts to black. So, what does our alternate timeline actually prove? Here's the thesis, and I think it's one that applies to both versions of this film. Hereditary is not really a film about demonic possession. It is a film about the violence of good intentions badly executed. Every catastrophic decision in that movie is made by someone who believes, on some level, that they are doing it for someone they love. Ellen loved Charlie and wanted to give her a divine host. Annie loved her children and couldn't hold herself together enough to protect them. Peter loved Charlie and could not live with what happened. In our alternate timeline, Steve loves Peter, and Steve's love, quiet, suppressed, radically misdirected Steve love, comes closer to destroying everything than any of the supernatural elements ever could. Because the cult needed a knife-wielding monster to complete the ritual, No, they needed a reasonable man who would keep the doors unlocked. That's the theory, and honestly, that's also the warning. The most dangerous people in horror films are rarely the ones with glowing eyes. They're the ones sitting 3 streets away in a parked car, telling themselves it'll all work out fine. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know. Drop it in the comments below. If you were Steve Graham and you received that letter, knowing everything it contained, knowing what was coming, knowing the alternative was watching your family tear itself apart from grief, would you have made the same call? Is there a version of that choice that's defensible? Or does the moment you open that negotiation, whatever answer you give, does the demon already have you? Let me know. I'll be reading every single one. But hey, that's just a theory. A MiniFlicks theory. Thanks for watching.